Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics. And in 2024, we are celebrating the 85th anniversary of Batman, the beloved Caped Crusader who first appeared on the printed page in 1939. This year also sees the 35th anniversary of director Tim Burton's original Batman, which is still one of my all-time personal favorites. Joining us tonight is the one man perhaps most responsible for bringing that Dark Knight interpretation to the big screen in the first place. Michael E. Uslan is a lawyer, author, and educator. As an award-winning producer, he is the one person to have his name attached to every single live-action and animated Batman-based feature film since 1989. How are you doing tonight, Michael?
I am doing just great. Thanks, Ryan. Happy to be here with you.
Oh, thank you. Now, let me ask you, obviously, this is a character that you grew up with that means a lot to you. But going back to the very beginning, what was your first exposure to the Batman character? Which iteration was it?
I can tell you exactly. I mean, literally exactly. It was 1956. I was on my big brother Paul's shoulders in Bayonne, New Jersey at a candy store that had a rack of comic books from floor to ceiling. And my dad had given Paul 30 cents to take me to the candy store to buy comic books, get out of their hair, probably. And of course, being a good big brother, he said he was going to buy two and I could buy one. So up I went onto his shoulders. And I remember very vividly seeing a copy of the latest issue of Detective Comics that featured the Batmobile looking like an assault tank on the cover. And I remember I would have been 5 years old. And I remember looking at it and then being too scared. There was something that was just too scary. So at that time, Superman was on TV. And Superman was very 5-year-old friendly. So I knew Superman, Clark Kent, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Perry White. So I drifted back to get a Superman comic instead. And what I wound up buying that day was literally, I remember this like it was just the other day. I bought Sugar and Spike #2. And it kept me happy. And it would not be until I was a much more sophisticated 7-year-old that I edged my way into the world of Batman and Gotham City.
Sure. And now I know a lot of people, and certainly myself included, revere the William Dozier 1966 Batman television show, of course, with Adam West and Burt Ward as Batman and Robin. As a child, I took it very seriously. To me, it was just as valid of interpretation as the Batman animated series, of course, the 90s feature films. But it wasn't until I was older, I watched it and I thought, oh, wow, this is actually like, it's a very brilliant tongue-in-cheek comedy. They knew what they were doing. But as as a kid growing up and watching that show for the first time, I understand it didn't quite meet up to your expectations even then.
That is about the understatement of a lifetime.
Sure.
Yeah, I have to take you back in the context of time. So when it came on the air, I was 14 years old.
Okay, all right.
I was already an ardent Batman and comic book collector. I was one of the earliest members of comic book fandom as comic book fandom was organized. I was an early subscriber to the first fanzine. I went to the first Comic-Con ever held on the planet Earth. So I was deeply ensconced in it, and I was getting the history. I was getting, Jules Pfeiffer had come out with a book, The Great Comic Book Heroes, that opened up the golden age of comics to me and reprinted the first Joker story and the origin of Batman. I had met my first mentor in the world of comic books, a brilliant creative man named Otto Binder, who was not only a great science fiction writer, he was the primary writer of Captain Marvel during the 1940s. Right.
Yes.
Created Mary Marvel, the Marvel family, Black Adam. And then he went to DC Comics where he co-created Supergirl, The Phantom Zone, Brainiac, Crypto, He was legendary. And it was at that first Comic-Con in a crumbling hotel downtown New York that Otto Binder introduced me to a man he said was the creator of Batman. And my jaw dropped. He said, Michael, meet Bill Finger.
Oh, wow.
And that was a life-changing moment for me because I didn't know who Bill Finger was. I didn't get it. Every Batman comic I had read had a little box with the name Bob Kane in it. And it was Bill Finger himself who told me how Batman was actually created. And I understood at that moment in time, and from all I was getting in the history of comics, what the original vision was of Bill Finger and Bob Kane in the creation of Batman as amplified by Jerry Robinson. And I felt as much of an allegiance to the integrity of the character of Batman as I did allegiance to the integrity of Bill Finger and Bob Kane and Jerry Robinson and what their vision was. So in a cold January night in 1966, I'd been waiting months for this to happen. I was so excited. And 20 minutes in, it really hits me that this is a comedy, that they have made a joke out of Batman, and that the whole world was laughing at Batman. And that, as a 14-year-old comic book fan, historian, who heard from Bill Finger I was created, that killed me. And
Yeah.
it was that night after the show, I made my vow. Like young Bruce Wayne once made a vow. I said, somehow, someday, I will show the world the true Batman. The Batman created in 1939. I will find a way to erase this pow zap wham crap from the collective consciousness of the world culture. And that became my mission at that moment in time. What you
Well,
have to understand, just one
yeah,
thing,
sure.
at that time, that was the only interpretation, the only vision people around the entire world had, people who had never read a comic book, had of Batman. And that's why it was so wrong to me, because that was it, the one and only. And that's when I set out on the impossible dream.
Well, to say you succeeded, in hindsight, it's certainly an understatement. But to go back, in the defense of the 1966 television show, as you know, as a comic book historian, you look at it like when I think of that really kind of gritty, noir infused, the very early, the Bill Finger, Bob Kane stories, Batman going solo, fighting the cult worshippers of Kali and all. They're very fascinating stories. I'm such a huge fan of like the case of the Chemical Syndicate. When we think of that iteration of the Dark Knight, that seemed to last relatively maybe about a year or so. But I mean, I'm sure when you were growing up, how did you feel about the comics sort of in the late 50s, early 60s, which at that point, the Silver Age, they did take a more cartoony direction at that time.
And that also is an understatement, because
Right.
when I was growing up in that era as a little boy and had Batman Genie, Batman Robot, the Super Batman of Planet X,
Yeah,
Bat frickin' Baby, Bat Baby, Bat this, Bat that, Rainbow Batman, Zebra Batman. I mean, I could go on and on and on.
of
It,
course. Yeah.
it was silly fun for a little boy. It was great because comic books then were being aimed at 8 to 12-year-old boys. But learning the history and then pressing, I used to write letters to everybody at DC Comics. My God, I was the biggest pain in the neck. And when Julie Schwartz took the mantle of Batman editorially and then brought in Denny O'Neil, Irv Novick, who doesn't get sufficient credit. Before Neil Adams, Irv Novick was there taking Batman first step back into the darkness. But you have O'Neil and Adams, Irv Novick, I got to give credit to, followed by Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers.
Yes. Yeah.
This was a restoration of the dignity and darkness to the Batman as envisioned by his creators. And when you go back, you went all the way back to the earliest days, which was when Batman, admittedly by Bill, was an incarnation of pulp heroes. He was a pulp hero, like the Shadow, distinctly like the Shadow.
Or Zorro, of
Uh,
course.
but by Batman #1, thanks to Jerry Robinson and Bill Finger, we now had the homicidal maniac of the Joker. We soon would have Two-Face. We would have Doctor Strange, Dr. Hugo Strange, that
Hugo
is.
Strange, yeah.
Yeah. And they would begin to develop the rogues gallery of supervillains. But that early rogues gallery, including Catwoman, was dark. It was dark. And yes, eventually we would get Tweedledum and Tweedledee and the Mad Hatter, and so it would go. But for me, it was about the original vision of the creators as brought back in a more sophisticated way in the 1970s.
Well, to give our audience a little bit of context, you were also notable for being the first person to teach an accredited college course on the history of the comic book as an art form, I believe, or I don't want to misquote it. Whoa. So this was very personal to you. So at what point do you get interested in studying law? And when you decide to kind of put your money where your mouth is, when's the moment, let's say in pop culture, were you sitting in a movie theater? When did the spark go off where you when you kind of decided, all right, I'm going to live up to my vow. I need to buy the rights to this character. I need to go about this and make it happen. When was that?
Okay, so let me give you the abridged, short, Classics Illustrated version of this
Sure.
origin story.
Yeah.
Secret origin story. Um, at the end of college, I tried to get a job, a creative job in the movie and TV industry. I sent out 372 resumes. I got 2 job offers. One was to move to New York City from Indiana University in the heartland and go to work for a major talent management firm, an agency in New York City, start in the mailroom for $95 a week. I was intending to get married after college and did not think my wife and I together could live on $95 a week in New York City. Offer number 2 was to go to work for a big time producer of movies for Universal. He had done a number of disaster movies. And he said, find the money to move to Los Angeles and I'll make you a production assistant. I go, what is that? And he smiled and said, well, you'll go for coffee, you'll photocopy lots of stuff, and I'll start you at $95 a week. Plan B, I went to law school. And I thought as plan B, if I took every course I could find having anything to do with communications or entertainment and honed my skills there, maybe I could get a job in the legal, business, and financial side of the movie industry, use that as a way to network like crazy, to meet everybody, to learn how you produce and finance movies, and do it like it's graduate school for like 4 years, and then sneak in a back window and get over into the writing and producing side of things. That was plan B, and amazingly enough, plan B worked. And what happened to me was I had started writing Batman comics, actually detective comics, and I was still in school. And when my first issue came out, Detective 460, through the tears of joy, I said, oh my God, you know, this has been a dream of mine to write Batman since I was 8 years old. I need a new dream. I don't have a dream. What am I going to do? And then I thought back to that night in 1966 and that vow I made. I said, okay, now's the time. And after working at United Artists, which was a major motion picture studio at the time, for almost 4 years, learning how you produce and finance movies, I said, this is it. And I went to the president of DC Comics and I said, I have credentials. I've been working in the movie industry for 4 years. I'm a lawyer. I want to buy the rights to Batman. And I want to go out and make dark and serious Batman movies and show the whole world that he's truly a Dark Knight, not a pot-bellied, funny, pow zap wham campy guy. And the president of DC Comics, who brought me into DC Comics originally, he read about me teaching the course in comics and called me and said, you are a very innovative young man. We're going to fly you to New York City and talk about ways we can work together. And then I started working at DC. And he looked at me like the poster for Home Alone. And he said, Michael, for God's sake, don't do this. I don't want to see you lose all your money. Don't you understand? Since Batman went off the air on television, the brand is, and this is a quote, Brian, The brand is as dead as a dodo. He said, Michael, nobody's interested in Batman anymore. I said, yeah, but nobody's ever seen a dark and serious comic book superhero movie before. This is going to be like a new form of entertainment. He said, is there any way I can talk you out of this? And I said, no. He said, okay, come on in. And that began a 6-month negotiation, giving me enough time to raise the money privately. And on October 3rd, 1979, I bought the rights to Batman, quit my job at United Artists, put Batman in my back pocket, flew to LA, and was turned down by every single studio and mini major in Hollywood.
And let me ask you something. I want to go back to that because it's very interesting. In this negotiation process, you say you closed the deal in 1979. Did the price go up after Richard Donner's Superman came out? Did the studio not see what this character was possibly worth?
We got to go back in the context of the time because it's the only way anybody will
Sure.
understand this. How does a kid in his 20s buy the rights to Batman? I mean, that is a notion that is completely impossible and inconceivable today.
Of course, yeah.
So what you have to know in the context of the time is this. At the time when Warner Communications had acquired Warner Brothers, DC Comics, Mad Magazine, comics were still being looked down upon. It was still the afterglow of Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent when comic books were being accused of poisoning the well for America's youth and turning them all into juvenile delinquents. The hierarchy in Hollywood were people who were adults during that Frederick Wortham finger pointing at comic books. And they looked down their noses at comic books and the characters and their creators. Nobody saw any value in Marvel whatsoever. And as far as DC went, Batman had his moment in the sun. He was toast. And nothing else in the DC library was capable of being turned into a blockbuster movie except Superman. It was the only property of value. So when I come walking in, look at this kid. We're going to tell him if he wants Batman, even though we know it's worthless. If he wants Batman, he's got to match the Superman deal. Oh my God. Oh my God, the kid fell for it. Oh my God, the kid said he's going to do it. We got, it was kind of that atmosphere. And so how did a kid in his 20s buy the rights to Batman? Nobody else in the entire world showed up.
Yeah. And as you alluded to earlier, your story, it's not unlike, it always reminds me, we always think of George Lucas, right? He shops the idea of Star Wars and is turned down by every major studio. And in hindsight, it's like, this is insane. How can you not have the foresight to think Star Wars is going to be a success? But it's the same thing with Batman. Like, we live in a world where not a year goes by without a new Batman project or property coming out. So, I mean, it really is almost, like you said, it's almost hard to wrap our minds around, like in this present day, thinking about what you and George Lucas had to go through to get these films made.
It's really true. I met him when we were both at the opening of the Mandalay Bay Hotel Casino in Las Vegas. And that night, Bob Dylan was playing, and they had a VIP section in the balcony. And there were 4 of us there. It was him and I think it was Linda Ronstadt maybe, and my wife and I had a chance to chit chat with him a bit. But yeah, it's a similar story in that regard. And as a result, I was not only turned down by everybody in Hollywood, I was told pretty much across the board it was the worst idea they ever heard. They said, you're out of your mind. You can't do serious comic book movies. You can't do dark superheroes. You can't make a movie out of an old TV series. Nobody's done that. So it was nothing but rejection.
So what happened within that, let's say about a decade time period, well, it was a decade from 1979 to 1989 when we see the Tim Burton film on the screen. Like, I've heard, and maybe you can clear up some of these rumors. I heard at one point it was going to have Bill Murray and Eddie Murphy attached to it, that they were trying to make a little bit more of a comedy before it got darker. I mean, how close were these other versions to being made?
Nothing was that close. There were different parties at different times, and often the executive ranks could be considered to be a bit of a revolving door. And it's like in any movie that's going to be developed, a lot of times, a lot of names are kicked around, lists are made. Hey, well, let's see if this one's available or if this guy might be interested. So it's to various degrees. I know they worked very hard to hide from me talks that were going on that would in any way, shape, or form twist it back to the TV series tone. But the main thing was about finding a filmmaker. That was always the main thing. So we started out, my first choice was Guy Hamilton, because
Yeah.
at that moment in time in 79, you only had as a major franchise Bond. And Guy Hamilton, I consider to be the best of the Bond directors. He had done Goldfinger, for
And
God's
Live
sake.
and Let Die, which is my favorite. So
Yeah. And so then there were two writers of Bond who were just standout writers. And we approached both of them. And I was happy to say we connected with Tom Mankiewicz. And Tom would come aboard to be the first writer involved in the project. But going back to director, I remember getting a call. We've got interest from Richard Rush. We're setting up a screening for you tonight of this new movie he's doing, The Stuntman. And this periodically would happen. Then we had Ivan Reitman come on, and Ivan was attached for quite a while, but under his contract, he could be preempted by Columbia to do one movie. And he was preempted by Columbia to do one movie, and that was Ghostbusters.
right.
So he was gone for a year plus. And then when he came back, it was like, I'm burned out. I can't just jump into another thing. Then I remember Joe Dante came aboard. I know Joe a long, long time. And then he got offered The Explorers from Paramount. And they were willing to pay him a fortune to do it. So all of a sudden, Joe was gone. And it was this constant one step forward, two steps back. Two steps forward, one step back. That's the best way I could describe a 10-year human endurance contest.
And so when you sign that deal, when you're working with the producers, Peter Guber, John Peters, how because I'm sure you feel the weight of the disappointments, the false starts. At what point did you kind of feel like, okay, this is really happening? This is it. The ball is finally rolling.
Well, here's the moment that changed in that regard. We had been, my partner, Ben Melniker, who was my dad's age. Ben was a legend in the movie business. He started at MGM in late 1939. Ultimately, all divisions reported to Ben. He was chairman of their film selection committee. He put together the deal for Ben-Hur, Dr. Zhivago, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Gigi and their musicals. And we had just been turned down by our last major studio, which was Columbia. And I had pitched to an old timer who Ben knew going back decades. And I pitched my heart out for my dark and serious Batman. And he said to me, it ain't going to work, kid. And he said, you can't do dark superheroes. It's not going to work. And then he turned to Ben and said, well, listen, Ben, you and I go back a long way. If you guys really want to do a Batman movie, I'll think about it. I'll consider it. But it's got to be that funny guy from TV with the Pow Zaps and the Whams, because that's the only one audiences will remember and love. And I said, no. And he pulled his chair up in front of me and leaned in and he said, son, better to have a movie made than no movie at all. And I looked at him and I said, no. That was the last studio. And after that meeting, Ben and I are on the studio lot. We're sitting on a bench and I am despondent. I knew that was the end of the studio line for us. And Ben said to me, Michael, isn't it ironic that the last no we received came from you? He said, you know what that makes you? I said, yeah, Ben, an idiot. He goes, no. He goes, you have this vision of Batman and how Batman should be treated and how his creator should be respected. He said, you are Batman's defender. You are Batman's protector. He said to me, Michael, you are Batman's Batman. Now, let's get up off this bench. There's other places to go besides studios. There's foreign sources, there's independent sources, and let's just redouble our efforts. And that was the moment that changed, because Ben said to me, you know, there's this guy named Peter Gruber. And I tried to hire him at MGM in 1969 because he was a young guy, a bright guy, to run MGM as a troika with Jerry Tarkowski and one other guy whose name escapes me. And he said, he's younger than all the guys you've been pitching to. I think he's hipper. I think he might get this. And he's now at Casablanca Records. And he and his partner, Neil Bogart, are like the kings of disco right now. But I've gotten word that Polygram of Europe is going to be doing a cash infusion to enable them to do feature films. He goes, let me get Peter on the phone. Barry Beckerman, he was the third one in the troika. So he got Peter on the phone, and I pitched over the phone from New York. And Peter said, wow, this is completely different. I love this. He goes, can you be in my office tomorrow and do this whole thing? I said, I can't get there by tomorrow, but I can be there the day after tomorrow. He said, great. So we went 2 days later in LA. I met Peter. I met Neil Bogart. Barry Beckerman was working there, and did my whole dark and serious Batman pitch. And Peter said, okay, Casablanca Records and now Filmworks will put up the development money and we'll get this thing going. And at that time, they had an output deal with Universal. So Batman was going to be a Universal picture.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how that whole ball started rolling.
Oh, wow. And, you know, we look at it now, that first Batman film, it was so revolutionary because it establishes so many things in the Batman lore, in the canon, that today that we take for granted. The idea of this kind of dark Art Deco twisted Gotham City, courtesy of production designer Anton Furst, Tim Burton's vision and the psychology of the characters. Now again, like that's just what Batman should be. But it's crazy to think about that even in the comic books at that point, they had not gone that far into that direction as far as the
Oh,
movie
no.
would go.
No. And here's where we got to give credit where it's due. And you've touched on the two geniuses that are involved here. Let's start with Tim Burton. He came into our lives in 1986. I got a call from the studio. They said, you got to see this, what this kid is doing for us. They screened for me a fine cut of Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And I was blown away by what I saw. They set up 3 lunches for me with Tim. And my number one thing was to make sure I could keep him far away from all the silly, goofy stuff. Number 2, to indoctrinate him into all the dark and serious stuff. And I was very surprised as a Disney animator that this kid was not into comic books, did not know all that much about Batman. So by the end of the 3rd lunch, I knew this was the guy. Now, here's the most important thing of all. It was Tim Burton who came up with this concept that I always referred to as the big idea, capital B, capital I. This was the idea that would change Hollywood forever. And that was the day he said to me, Michael, if we're going to do the first ever dark and serious comic book superhero movie and want it to be taken seriously and don't want to get unintentional laughs from the audience, this movie cannot be about Batman. This movie must be about Bruce Wayne. That's it, Ryan. That was what changed history. That's what changed the entire world culture's perception of comic books and superheroes. And that's what triggered his decision to go with Michael Keaton, because Keaton playing an obsessed and driven Bruce Wayne would make audiences go, oh yeah, that's a guy who would get dressed up as a bat. And they would be able to suspend their disbelief. If we had used one of the quote unquote serious actors of 1988, Tim was afraid he didn't know how to do that without getting unintentional laughs from the audience. So there's the big idea. And the corollary he had for the big idea was about world building. And he said, from the opening frames of this movie, Gotham City must be the 3rd most important character in the piece, because if the audiences don't believe in Gotham from the opening, they will never accept a guy dressed as a bat. So The script comes in from Sam Hamm. There's literally one line describing Gotham City as if hell has erupted from under the earth. My dear friend Anton Furst, absolute genius, he was mystified. And he said to Tim, I don't know what this means. What does it mean? And Tim said to him, I think it means New York City had there never been planning and zoning. And that's when Anton said, I get it. Goes off, studies conflicting styles of architecture, comes in with all the plans for Gotham City, the Batmobile, the whole look of the picture. And I contend to this very day, this coming opening weekend, every single genre picture over the last 35 years has been influenced by Tim Burton's vision. You can see it. It's been influenced by Anton Furst's designs, and it's been influenced by the magical notes of Danny Elfman. And that resonates right to today.
In that genre, I mean, to me, those are the two scores that stick out. It's John Williams' Superman theme and Danny Elfman's Batman theme. And I don't want to say they haven't been taught, because there's a lot of other wonderful companion works. And, you know, you look at the music of Hans Zimmer, John Ottman, a lot of amazing composers who were inspired by what John Williams and Danny Elfman did.
It's so utterly, utterly true. And it was Stan Lee who told me at lunch one day, he said, you know, Michael, I'm buying you lunch today. I said, well, that's unusual. I said, what's the occasion? He said, this is a thank you lunch. I said, for what? He goes, if it wasn't for that first Batman movie, there would be no Marvel Cinematic Universe. He said,
Which is true.
That's what made the difference. Oh, okay. We're not really going to make Iron Man movies. We're going to make Tony Stark movies. We're not really going to be making Spider-Man movies. We're going to be making Peter Parker movies. He said, that's what opened the door.
Let me ask you, and we can jump ahead to that because I definitely want to cover that. But after pushing this boulder uphill for over a decade, what was it like standing there? It was Pinewood Studios, right? You're in London, being surrounded by these outdoor massive sets. You're looking at Anton Furst's incredible Batmobile, which, in my opinion, it's still the best Batmobile design. What did that feel like for you, seeing it come to life?
It was a surrealistic out-of-body experience. It was a magical dream come true moment. I remember walking 5 square city blocks with Ben for the first time. And Ben turned to me, he goes, you know, Michael, when I was at MGM and we did Ben-Hur, I said, there will never in history be sets more grandiose than this. He goes, I was wrong. He goes, Michael, this puts Ben-Hur to shame.
I don't know
And
about that, but it's still pretty good. I love Ben-Hur, just saying.
well, no, he's not saying that it put the movie to shame.
Of course, but yeah, but still,
It put the set construction,
Yeah.
to shame. So I mean, it was really amazing, and to be there on that rooftop, inside it was a built rooftop, standing 4 feet away at the moment Michael Keaton picks him up and says, "I'm Batman." And to have my 2 kids who were 8 and 4 at the time being taken on a ride in the Batmobile through Gotham City by our stunt driver. I mean, these were moments that just were worth everything.
Oh, absolutely. Now, let me ask you, Michael, like for this current generation, right? People who have grown up with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the X-Men films, the Spider-Man films, I'm sure there's people in the audience here today who have never seen this original Batman movie before. What do they have to look forward to?
They have to look forward to a movie that, while made in that came out in 1989, does not in any way, shape, or form appear to be an 80s movie. It is a timeless movie. And that is because Tim Burton and Anton Furst and the rest of the talented crew worked together to create a vision that would be a combination of past, present, and future. It's a conglomeration mix of time eras. And put together, you can't specifically say if it's past, present, or future. And as a result, it really does stand up beautifully today, beautifully. And because Batman has no superpowers, it wasn't laden with the special effects of that moment, pre-CGI. Instead, you've got a lot of stunt work. You've got a lot of practical effects. And something that was then done also by another genius named Christopher Nolan when he came back to restore the darkness and dignity to Batman and did so based on practical effects rather than CGI.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly a treat, as you mentioned, the mixture, Anton Furst, Tim Burton, Danny Elfman, Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson. There's so much talent that in a lot of ways, I feel like, I can't speak for you, but I feel like I speak for myself as a fan, as a movie fan, as a lover of this material. Maybe it was for the best that this movie hadn't been made 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier. The version we got, this is the version that will live on in history, this iteration.
You are right about that because 5 or 10 years earlier, you would have had a James Bond influenced Batman movie.
Which that
That's
would have been
all,
cool too. But
all the world would have known. That's all we all would have known.
right.
But in the way that the world works cosmically, waiting for Godot, waiting for Tim Burton, um, made all the difference in the world. And I said it recently also, put a different context on it. I went back into the files, and starting in 1990, I started pushing Warner Brothers that we need to do a movie that would show Batman as the world's greatest detective. It's a side of Batman that never been shown before. I had to wait 32 years to get that movie in The Batman. And I could sit back and say, man, it was worth the wait. And the opening credits should have been based on the character Batman, published by DC Comics, appearing in Detective Comics.
Correct. All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, from 1989, director Tim Burton's Batman. So when you're on set, when you're on that Pinewood, those massive sound stages, and you're seeing Michael Keaton in his suit for the first time, like how do you feel, like what is it like seeing this character come from the 2D printed page to seeing standing right in front of you with that amazing textured costume?
Well, the original question was, did Tim really make Michael Keaton work as Batman slash Bruce Wayne? And I remember the first time I saw him on set, there were tons of people around, and you couldn't just pick him out. I mean, he didn't have the cowl and the cape on; he had the rest of it on, but he was like my height. And as Tim always said, I can cheat the height, I can cheat the musculature, and a square jaw does not a Batman make when you take him from comic books to movies. Um, so it wasn't until the first dailies that I said, "Oh my God, he nailed it.
Mm-hmm.
He really nailed it." That was the moment. With Nicholson, it was a whole different story. Um, the Nicholson story took place for me May 1980. Memorial weekend was about to start. I'm in New York City, heading back to New Jersey on a bus. I got the afternoon paper. I opened it up. Two big movies are opening for the holiday: The Empire Strikes Back and a horror movie called The Shining. And as I turn the page in the newspaper, I see for the first time this maniacal looking picture of Jack Nicholson peering around a doorway. It's the iconic "Here's Johnny" shot. I go, oh my God, look at this. This is the only actor who could play the Joker. This is it. And I tore it out of the paper. And when I got home, I ran to my desk. I took white out. I whited out Jack's face. I took a red pen and I did Jack's lips. I took a magic marker. I did his hair. And that's what I showed Tim and everybody from the studio, that Jack Nicholson is the only actor who could play the Joker. And the day he was hired was the greatest day of my career to that point. I was just, that was going to give us the credibility we needed. It was just going to make everything work. And it did. I mean, he was absolutely incredible. And remember, at that time, the late 80s, in the comic books, the Joker was the clown prince of crime, and he was bringing that to life. And he had just started to get dark again with Batman 252, thanks to Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil. And that part of it was back into the mix. So it was just a magical convergence of all of these things happening.
hmm And my understanding was the script was constantly being rewritten on set. You're coming up with new ideas, shifting things around. Do you feel like when you're interacting with Nicholson and Keaton, do you feel like they took it? Did they see the vision that Tim Burton and you had, or do you feel like they didn't take it as seriously until they saw the dailies and the finished results? I mean,
No, no,
what do
no,
you
no,
think?
no. They signed on to Tim Burton and Tim Burton's vision.
hmm
Period. End of story. They were completely in tune with that. Yes, they had their own ideas to offer, which were of great value. But yeah, it was them doing it because they believed in Tim Burton.
hmm So the movie comes out. It's a tremendous box office success, a critical success. But looking back at that era, I was born after the original Batman movie came up. But from my childhood, when you look at the films that kind of were made to cash in on the success of Batman, it's movies like Dick Tracy, The Rocketeer, The Phantom, which are more pulp figures. Why do you feel like Hollywood was still hesitant in adapting these other comic book characters from DC or Marvel?
Well, Marvel at that time, their deal was whoever showed up at their offices with the biggest pile of option money on the desk got the rights. So as a result, there were so many false starts. There was a Captain America movie that literally couldn't cut together, that they
Right.
wound up releasing direct to home video. There was an initial Punisher movie that didn't do it, and they released it direct to home video. The great Roger Corman wound up with the rights to the Fantastic Four,
Right, right.
and he had to make a movie by a certain date to preserve his rights. So he made his Fantastic Four movie for under $1 million, and you got what you paid for. So there were all these early miscues, and the rights to Spider-Man. It turned out four different companies were claiming they had the rights to Spider-Man, and it would be decades of litigation before they could straighten all of that out. So that's what sidetracked the whole Marvel thing. Um, Going back to ours, you got to remember by the time we came out, there had been at least three or four Superman movies,
hmm
and they now weren't exactly working so well.
Sure.
So that was coming to the end of the line, and here we were fresh, starting out at the gate. Um, and people said, well, you have to have a locomotive. You have to have something with name value like Batman. And how many properties have the name value of a Batman or a Superman? So a lot of companies remained hesitant, afraid that they couldn't do anything. But if you look historically at the most successful comic book based movies that came out after Batman, it was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it was The Mask, it was Men in Black. Now, those three comic books, I don't think ever sold more than 5 or 10,000 copies of an issue. And people in Hollywood began to realize, oh, wait a minute, you mean it's how good the story is? How good the characters are? Oh my God, this is a new way of thinking. And that's what began to open the door to the Crow and everything else that would come afterwards.
Well, let me ask you, because I'm curious, just as a viewer and as a fan of this fantastical world, how did you feel? Did you feel vindicated when you're sitting in the movie theater watching movies like The Crow or Blade for the first time? These very serious, dark, kind of philosophical, visually interesting superhero movies.
Um, I felt I'll take the credit or the blame for what was happening.
hmm
I had been ambushed. I was invited to the French Film Festival in Sarasota, Florida, and it was like late '89 or early '90, as a guest of the festival. And I got there, and oh my God, I got under attack from all over. They basically were accusing me of destroying French culture because Batman was monopolizing movie theaters in France and knocking out French cinema. And how dare we? And man, I was taking it on the chin. And to this day, you hear a lot of people going, well, Hollywood's never been the same. We've got all of these superhero movies, and too many of them are coming out now that are just cookie cutter, and they're
hmm
oversaturating the marketplace. So, I sit here and duck and cover as to whether I should take the blame or the credit.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you're enjoying the credit, right? I think there's certainly more good than bad. And it's kind of fascinating when you think about these movies. especially in the last 5 or 10 years, with like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, the DC Extended Universe, of course. It's so like these movies have made billions and billions of dollars, which logically speaking, you have to consider that means more people have probably seen these films than have ever picked up a comic book.
Oh my God, that's so true. That is so true. And whatever they made in the movie theaters, they've made more than that in merchandise and theme
Mm-hmm.
parks and all the other stuff that goes with it, video games. So yeah, it's I am really, really happy to have been involved in paving the way for so many of my friends and mentors and idols who created our modern day mythologies,
Mm-hmm.
who were denigrated during their own years, during their own careers, who were looked down upon because comic books were considered somewhere between the tool of the devil or written off as simply just for little kids. So that's been a great part of it too, to see the respect coming not only to the characters and the companies, but specifically to the men and women who created these great pieces of contemporary folklore.
I'm curious from a legal perspective, since you bought the film rights initially, but once you sell it to the studio, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. After that first Batman movie gets made, do you have how does that work? Do you have quite a bit of a say in how the films are developed? Like if they send you the script for Batman and Robin, can you say, well, no, this is definitely what I don't want to do? Like how does that work up to a certain point?
I remember when I got the script of Batman and Robin, upon finishing it, I was sitting on the couch in my office. I threw it across the room, barely missing our head of development who had just walked in from lunch.
Oh, geez.
And it hit the side and the pages went flying and separating. Um, you at the end of the day, it's money talks, right? So you do what you can do to present a rational understanding of what is important in terms of story, character, themes, tone, and you do the best you can do under the circumstances. And sometimes I can think of one, at least two cases, maybe three, where I was working harder to stop something from happening than making something happen.
Right. So,
And even though it was against my own financial interests, because at the end of the day, I've been in this since day one because of the passion.
mhm.
And I can't be Batman's Batman if I'm willing to sell him out for a buck. So
Right.
that's always been something that has governed it. But we all know how Hollywood works. We're big boys and we have to wear big pants. And that's how it goes.
Sure. One other question I have is that, when even as an adult, I'm revisiting Batman the animated series, even the Adam West television show. Look, I love the Tim Burton films. I love Batman Forever. I love the Christopher Nolan trilogy. What makes this character so fascinating is that each one of these incarnations, they're as tonally different as you can get from anything, from one to the other. But yet you're watching the Adam West Batman TV show, the animated series, all those characters are immediately recognizable, right? You know who Selena Kyle is, you know who the Joker is, who Alfred is, who Bruce Wayne is, right? So I think Batman must be the only fictional character in movie history who's been interpreted in so many, so many far different incarnations, yet he's still recognizable and financially successful. Why is that?
It's because organically, that's how it was done in the comic books. The comic books themselves have treated Batman from one extreme interpretation to the other extreme interpretation. So transposing that into media, you actually have the luxury of saying which era of Batman you want to reflect. I always thought in my own mind's eye that Batman 1989 was more the 1939-40 Batman.
Mm-hmm.
Batman Returns to me was more of the 1990s, really, really dark Batman. Batman Forever was more of the darkly romantic Batman, kind of the Marshall Rogers kind of a thing. Batman and Robin was the 60s Batman, Pow Zap Wham Redux. But everything has been treated, you could trace it back to a different era in the comic book. So that's one thing. Second big important thing is Batman is human. Everybody can identify with Batman. And what that means, I have learned, is that allows and enables each individual person to impose their own philosophies, their own politics onto Bruce Wayne, onto Batman. And it was never more evident than with Dark Knight. When The Dark Knight came out, I got the biggest kick out of watching everybody on TV talking about it. And if you turned on Fox News, the right wing was claiming Batman as their character. But if you turned on MSNBC, the left wing was saying, no, that's our guy. And there was just this wide spectrum of interpretation that people could do. I think it's really, truly amazing and unique. I agree with you. He's the only superhero in existence that can be anything to anyone, because at the end of the day, he is a symbol.
Mm-hmm. Right, because even Superman, you take it too far in one direction, it's polarizing. James Bond, as different as Daniel Craig and Roger Moore are, they could theoretically exist in the same universe. But Batman, you have these wonderfully different, almost Shakespearean interpretations, and they all work in their own way.
Even the Lego Batman worked.
Even the Lego Batman.
You were not laughing at Batman. You were laughing with Batman. And maybe one final word, Ryan. I think it's important.
Sure.
Today, I embrace the Batman TV series of the 60s, because it is no longer the one and only vision of Batman that's out there. And it serves a valuable function now of a way to introduce young kids into the world of Batman. Mm-hmm. Let them start out with that, or with the animated Batman meets Scooby-Doo, and then gradually introduce them to the comic books, to the movies, and ultimately to the video games. And let's give the world a chance to literally grow up with Batman. And I think that it really does serve a good purpose.
Right. Mr. Michael Uslan, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for being Batman's Batman.
Thank you, Ryan.
All right. If you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film and the conversation as much as I did. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.